The relationship between religion and the state is an ongoing point of contention in nations around the world. What kind of influence, if any, should religious groups have on government? Should prayer be a part of public life? How tolerant should we be of other religious expressions in society? We can gain insight into these and other important issues by studying the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, as long as we realize that these were not the only viewpoints being expressed by biblical authors at that time. Listen as Melody Knowles describes how some Jews responded to their religious callings in a land growing more and more diverse around them.
It's the year 539 BCE, and the Persians have just conquered Babylon. Cyrus, the new emperor, has granted those who have been exiled from Judah the opportunity to return to their land. The book of Ezra begins with the words of Cyrus's edict allowing the Jews to return home, and this proclamation sets up the themes that the post-exilic community will deal with for centuries to come. For people who have lived without a temple, proper temple worship will become a major theme. For people now geographically divided, some still living in Babylon and some having returned to the land, properly defining communal boundaries will also be a major concern. And, as always, the community of returning exiles will have to decide how to live faithfully and practice righteousness. The book of Ezra especially puts great emphasis on the first of these themes, temple worship. According to the Cyrus proclamation, the people were allowed to return to the land because the Lord has charged me, that is Cyrus, to build him a house. God needs a temple, and Cyrus needs people to build it. So some of the exiles return to build, while others stay behind to aid the building project by giving gifts for the temple. The detailed inventory of the temple vessels returned to Jerusalem in Ezra 1:7-11 emphasized the importance of this theme of temple worship. And we see it again in the record of the first acts of the returnees once they are in the land. As soon as they came to the house of the Lord in Jerusalem, some of the heads of the families made free will offerings for the house of God. And once the exiles are settled in their towns, they return again to Jerusalem to offer sacrifices, setting up the altar even before the temple is built. Then, in Ezra 3, as the building of that temple gets underway, the people celebrate the laying of the foundation. And here, right at a high point of the temple theme, we see the second theme, defining the boundaries of the community. To this point in the book of Ezra, we read of two parts of the Jewish community: those who returned to Jerusalem with Sheshbazzar, and those who stayed in Babylon. And according to the text, there's no apparent friction between these communities. But we read of a new group in Ezra chapter 4. There, the text calls this new group adversaries. But clearly these adversaries would be surprised by that designation, for according to them, they serve the same God and follow the same religious protocols. But the group of returning exiles don't agree. They say to this group of the people of the land, "You shall have no part with us in building a house to our God. We alone will build to the Lord." According to the book of Ezra, then, the temple building project of those exiles who returned from Babylon was thwarted by those who were already in the land. The theme of temple worship bumps up against the theme of defining community boundaries. Despite the fact that the people of the land worshipped and served the same God as the people returning from exile, the prevailing sentiment was, they're not like us at all. In fact, they're against us. And so in the midst of power struggles and community boundary making, the temple rebuilding project languished for years. Only later, with the help of the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, is the temple finally built. And here again, at another high point of the temple theme, we hear of yet another group of people. According to Ezra 6:21, the rebuilt temple was celebrated with a Passover festival. During this Passover, the temple's rebuilding was shared by the people who had returned from exile, and also by all who had joined them and separated themselves from the pollution of the nations of the land to worship the Lord, the God of Israel. At this temple celebration, the returned exiles are confronted by another group of people, only this time the strangers are allowed to join. On this occasion, the boundaries of the community are stretched to include those who did not live in Babylon during the exile, but separated themselves from the foreign nations and worshiped the God of Israel. The book ends with a very strong word against the polluting nature of these foreign nations. In chapters 7 through 8, we hear of another return from Babylon, that of Ezra and his party. And like the first return in the first chapters of the book, there's a similar emphasis on temple worship, with the bringing of gifts for the temple and the group's sacrifice when they reach Jerusalem. And again, the theme of communal boundaries comes up. But this time the theme concerns marrying those outside of the community, or as Ezra 9:1 puts it, marrying those who have not separated themselves from the people of the land with their abominations. Ezra clearly believed that the risk to the community is so great that they must act according to the law and send away all the foreign wives and children. This same condemnation of mixed marriages appears in the book of Nehemiah, along with a concern for temple worship seen in the long pledge the people make to provide for the ongoing sacrifices of the temple in chapter 10. Also, as in Ezra, in the book of Nehemiah, foreigners try to thwart the building campaigns of the community. Concern for marking the boundaries of the community through genealogy and religious practice are just as important for Nehemiah as for Ezra. The walls of the city serve not only as a physical defense, but also as a way to prevent the Sabbath from being profaned. Throughout Ezra and Nehemiah, everything is at stake in living according to God's law. This is a community well acquainted with the catastrophe of exile and with no desire to see such punishment repeated. The seriousness with which they regard righteousness cuts right into the heart of their understanding of family. Yet sending away the foreign wives is not the only response the community gave during this time. Other texts in the Old Testament, also from the post-exilic period, sketch the boundaries of the community in different ways. According to Ezra and Nehemiah, righteousness necessitated very strict communal boundaries. Foreigners, because of the threats that they posed to righteous worship, were strictly excluded. Yet Isaiah 56 projects a vision of the future where foreigners who love God's name and keep the Sabbath will be accepted by God in the temple. And in the book of Jonah, the Gentiles are the pious ones, ready to hear and obey the word of God. Curiously, this post-exilic period is also the time when the wisdom literature of the Hebrew Bible, such as Proverbs, comes to be codified. It's curious because Proverbs is a text deeply influenced by international traditions. According to many scholars, Proverbs chapter 22:17 through 24:22 is a section modeled after the Egyptian text, the instruction of Ammon and Opeh. In Proverbs, we hear practically nothing about Israel's historical traditions, no stories about Moses or the Exodus or David. In Proverbs, God's revelation comes not in the particular traditions of Israel throughout time, but rather in observing the timeless workings of the natural order. Although the book raises some issues about the dangers of the foreign or strange woman in chapters 1 through 9, throughout most of the book, right living comes about not by excluding the foreigner, but in adapting some of the insights of other traditions and marshaling them under the fear of the Lord. The victory of Cyrus brought not only a new political order to the ancient Near East, it also brought new theological choices and horizons for God's people. Faithful living came to be seen in an international context. Part of the community lives in the land with regular access to the temple, and other parts remain outside the land, known as the diaspora. And this diversity of geography is mirrored by a diversity of opinion about how to define the community and how to incorporate foreigners. Yet in all of these diverse strands, the biblical text tells of a community trying to live faithfully, trying to discern the will of God and God's own righteousness for their own times.